Hello, humane marketers. Sarah Zinacroce here. Welcome to another episode of the Humane Marketing Podcast, a place to be for the generation of marketers who cares. This is the show where we talk about marketing your business in a way that feels good to you, is aligned with your values, and also resonates more with your conscious customers because it's not pushy, ethical, and also beautiful. So if you're a regular here, you know that I'm organizing the conversations around the 7 Ps of humane marketing. And if you're new here and this is your first time, welcome. I'm so excited you're here. You may want to download your one-page marketing plan with the 7 Ps of humane marketing in the form of a mandala at humane.marketing/one page, the number one and page. So again, humane.marketing/one page. And with that, with no further ado, let's dive into today's conversation. Hi, Amy. So good to talk to you today. I can't wait to dive into this topic. We've been talking already beforehand, so really excited.
Likewise, and it's so fun to be on your podcast. Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, so we want to talk about the P for people of my humane marketing mandala. And in our conversation, it's really about people flourishing at work. That is kind of your specialty, right? And I think before we get started, maybe you can tell us a little bit how that became your specialty. How did you get into this field?
Yeah. Well, just to start with the P part of it, I spent a decade as a human-centered designer at a design company called IDEO. And there we just really learned how to understand people and what their needs are. And one of the things that we always believed and practiced was you help people by recognizing where they are and then taking them one step further, not by starting with what, they might hope or you might hope is their ideal aspiration. And so that's really the genesis of my corporate training and my professional training. And I'm just applying that at work. One of the things I had the chance to do in my consulting career was work all over the world and with companies all over the world. And I saw the same challenges all over the world, which is that we are not flourishing at work. It is hard to flourish at work. And there are cultural challenges that make that hard. And I say culture kind of quite broadly. It's not American culture. It's not, Silicon Valley corporate culture. It's the kind of universal workplace culture that we've developed over years. Right. So that's really the genesis of how I got started.
Yeah, it's so good when you said, kind of take people from where they are. I think it makes me think of my work with selling and how often we want them to sell kind of this future version of themselves instead of acknowledging where they are first. So this concept applies to, I guess, so many different things, right? In design, and it applies to sales and marketing probably as well. So interesting. And the other thing you said is this idea of culture, and yeah, we're going to go into that idea a little bit more. The work culture that we've created over, what is it, the last, what would you say, 20, 50 years? How long?
Oh, probably 50, 75 years. We've created this culture of drive, which is great in so many ways, but it creates this sense that if we're not exhausted, we're not succeeding. And that's the kind of paradigm that we need to break in order to flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like we created, the last kind of breakthrough was the Industrial Revolution. And so that's kind of, we were very proud to create this really, deep work ethics, and gotta work and even the schools, if we think about, we're going to be talking about work spaces, but if you think about the schools, I often have this conversation with fellow parents. It's like the schools have never changed since the Industrial Revolution. And we're still teaching the kids as if they were like little soldiers who have to, eventually go to work. And it's just like, it's so frustrating at times. Do you feel frustrated in your work sometimes as well? Because you just wish you could go faster?
Oh, always. Every day I wish I could go faster. And I think, we're going to talk about some practical things that you can do in your workplace or any of your listeners can do. But I often crave, I think we need a cultural revolution here, or revolution is the right word. We really need to create a new paradigm in the workplace. And in fact, what's so interesting, you're right. We started with this sort of industrial revolution sort of belief in increased productivity. What's been proven more recently is that when we are balanced, when we are flourishing, when we are not giving everything to work, that's when it actually goes better. Productivity increases, efficiency increases, client satisfaction, customer satisfaction increases. But it's counterintuitive for us because I think of what our culture has taught us.
Yeah. Yeah. So much so. I mean, even I was sharing on LinkedIn about, the recent Morocco trip, and I shared about feeling, even on vacation, this urge of always going to the next thing, right? We had this 8-day trip through Morocco, and I was like, it felt like, I had to go to the next city and, see more things. And then we just actually decided, okay, let's rest for 2 days. And coincidence or serendipity wanted it. The place we were at was called Agds, and in Arabic or Berbian language, that actually means rest place. So I'm like, well, if that's not a sign to, just rest. Exactly. But yeah, even on vacation, we're like, chasing after the next thing. And that reminds me of something you said during our pre-call, is this kind of this visual of the hamster wheel. That many of your clients feel like they're spinning in this hamster wheel, and it's almost kind of like a surreal world that they're spinning in. So yeah, when that comes up, how do you help them with, I guess, change of perspective and some tools? How do you work with clients who give you that answer?
Yeah, one of the things I was reflecting on our last conversation too, and that image. One of the things that's been so powerful for me over the past couple of years, as I've worked in this, full time in this space, is the sense that so many of us feel like we're alone. We're all individually suffering from something that others seem not to be. And one of the things that I do in my work, when I work with teams and companies, is I'll spend a lot of time one-on-one with people inside of the organization, and then I'll play back to them, here are the things that are barriers to flourishing in your organization. Here are the things that are supportive. And when I play back the barriers, so often I get this comment of, I thought it was just me. I didn't realize other people were suffering. And I think that's part of where this hamster wheel image comes from, is this idea that I'm alone fighting the good fight against this culture that everyone else is thriving in, but we aren't thriving. So I think that's the first thing, is just recognizing the collective challenge that we all have, and the fact that it's not a unique individual one. And then therein lies the answer for me. I very much believe that community is the sort of counterweight or the support to flourishing at work. We flourish through our connections with other people. And so that's often what we'll do, is we'll start with a community, be it a working team, be it a leadership team, be it a team of people at middle management, for instance, and just identify what's one thing that they want to do to support their sense of flourishing. And then we do it together.
Yeah. It seems so simple, right? It seems so simple because it's like, well, all these people are there, you have all these colleagues. So just get together with them and share what you're feeling, and that you're, feeling this idea of loneliness or being in a hamster wheel. And yet I think part of that industrial revolution training has been like, no, you just got to power through it, and you have to just wear your mask and do your spiel and kind of, embrace this role, because at work, that's how you behave. Is that the hardest part, to get people to actually, learn how to be in community?
So I think we all have the natural instinct to be in community. I think we've all realized that, especially over the last 2 years when we haven't been together. So we have that natural instinct and that capability. What's hard actually is turning it from just community about how do we achieve the next task or get the next thing done or ship the next product. Two, how do we take some of that time and talk about how we work? What we focus on, or I focus on when I help people, is like, let's have a conversation about how you're working, not just what you're working on. And that's like, it is simple actually. And it's also it feels very indulgent to take the time to talk about how we work. But absolutely, small changes can make a big difference.
Mm. Yeah, you're so right. It's this idea of, just like I shared about the pausing on vacation, we just don't want to take the time to do something that feels like we're doing nothing, right? Yeah. It's like, why are we talking about, how we work instead of what's the next thing we need to accomplish? And I also, when you talked, I thought, well, that's true in the workplace. And I definitely see it in my husband's company. But I would even say that even in the entrepreneurial space, we have become these kind of lone wolves and everybody on their own. And even though we say that we have, Facebook groups and all these social media networks to kind of be in touch, even there, I feel like it's still not this authentic connection where we actually help each other. So I do feel like we can't just say, oh, it's all the corporate stuff that's not doing a good job. I think even in the entrepreneurial space, we need to kind of pause and say, okay, let's really collaborate and co-create, because I don't think that we have been doing that. And for us, there really is no excuse, right? Where in the corporate world, maybe, someone up there creates the culture and then, you just live in that culture, where for us, we actually have the privilege to be able to create that. So have you seen that also, in kind of your entrepreneurial fields, that there's a shift happening there too?
So much of what you said just resonated with me right now. And one of the things that I think ties corporate culture and entrepreneurial culture together is the broader culture that we're living in. And again, I mean that quite broad. I spent a big chunk of my career outside of the US, and I saw this in Asia, I saw it in Australia, I saw it in Europe, as well as in the US. But culturally, it feels bad if we're not pushing. And that is what creates that ripple effect in big companies. But it's also what creates this drive in us to keep going as entrepreneurs and to not stop and reflect as much as we know we should. I mean, how did it feel when you took a time to pause on your vacation, right? It feels good, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Like we said before the call, it feels like at the first 2 days, it's like, oh, really? Am I just really unplugging? And it feels weird. But then once you do, it's like, oh, this is what life is all about. Let's face it. That's where, the memories happen. That's where you create memories for your kids and in your family, and not in the business exchanges so much.
Right. So we know intuitively, when we have this felt sense that pausing is good for us. And yet culturally, we have this sort of, this voice that comes in and sounds like our own voice in our own head that says, you've got to be pushing harder. You've got to be working faster. And so the first thing is just kind of acknowledging that there's a tension there, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where I landed on this concept of flourishing at work. Originally I was playing around with different ways in, different different language, but flourishing really spoke to me. And I'll tell you why. One, so scientists have studied what makes people flourish. And I love that there's science behind this. We know what makes us feel good. But the thing that really connected with me for flourishing, and I'm curious if it resonates with you too, is the idea that flourishing encompasses how we achieve, how we connect, and how we recharge. It really kind of says all of these things are important to making us feel good. You can't have achievement without recharge. You can't have recharge without achievement, and you can't have any of them without connection. Mm-hmm. And so sort of recognizing that those are all pieces of the puzzle that are important is how I kind of help others and myself, frankly, as well, to get this sense of flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah. What I just saw is the image of a flower and, you know, these different petals that, like you said, pieces of the puzzles. And I was like, yeah, and kind of flourishing the flower, you know, pieces, different petals, basically, that all are needed for us to flourish. That's so true. Yeah. So what's the opportunity? Where, you know, what can we do as entrepreneurs, and what are you working on with companies to create that shift? And maybe, you know, some companies already recognize the need for the shift, and then there's probably others who are still, you know, lost in the industrial revolution, and they haven't even recognized the shift. Where would you say, kind of percentage wise, how many companies have already recognized something needs to change?
It's a great question. And one, I'll start with your prompt about what's the opportunity. I love that you ask it that way. You know, as I said earlier, I was trained as a designer, and as designers, we're always trained to look for the opportunity that sort of sits in the problem.
Right.
And so there's a lot of talk lately about burnout. There's a lot of talk about languishing.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, studies will say up to, you know, sort of 75% of people have felt overwhelmed, stress, burnout in their workplaces. So the issue is there. The opportunity for me is to flip it around and say, well, okay, that's one thing, burnout's one thing. How do we flourish? Let's focus on how do we flourish? What does it look like to flourish? Do companies recognize this? Absolutely. I would say many of them do. I'd say what they grapple with is how can we be effective here? And a lot of attention has been put on well-being programs in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And what these can actually do unintentionally is exacerbate the problem, because they're offered as individual resources. Here's something for you, employee X, to go and do. And what that isn't acknowledging is that there's this communal thing. There's this culture that we've all created and we've all kind of understood and accepted in our workplaces, whether they're startups or large companies. And that culture is what makes it hard for us to make the change. And so I have really tactical things that people can do to start flipping this. But yes, acknowledging that there's a real need is the first step. And I think a lot of companies are there. What they grapple with is how can we tactically make the change?
Yeah. You're so right about the individual solutions, and they're probably, you know, they're probably not wrong. They're a good first step. They're a nice to have, but they are not going to solve the problem of, you know, for example, the Great Resignation. People won't stay just because they now have a weekly meditation class in the company, right?
Yeah.
So it's really the culture, that the communal aspect of the workplace that needs to change, and that I think younger generations are just requiring that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, the other thing, I guess, that we're also having to solve is, yes, we want communities, and yet the trend is that we're all not going back to the actual office and workspace. So it's like an additional challenge. People are going to still work from home, and so we need to somehow create community while being all over the place and not necessarily together.
No, absolutely. That's so true. And, you know, I just want to comment on your point about the younger generations are demanding that. Like, when you look into the data, it is Generation Z and the millennials who are more likely to be demanding change. Right. You know, us older folks and Gen X, et cetera, recognize it and need it as well. We're just less likely as a generation to insist on it. And I love that these younger generations are, because I believe that it's the change that we need in our organization. So even if, you know, as leaders, we're hesitant to kind of make cultural changes, recognizing that the younger generations coming up are not going to accept the status quo, I think is really good business motivation. So that, I think, is really compelling opportunity for us. In terms of like, what can we tactically do? And your point that many of us are not going back to the office, I think that there's still so much that we can that we can do even when we're not physically connected. And one of the biggest things that I talk about with the teams that I work with is this idea that there are transactional interactions with our colleagues and there are relational interactions with our colleagues.
Mm.
And so much of what we've done over the past 2 years has leaned towards the transactional, right? We're online. We're going to just get this thing done that we need to collaborate on. Maybe there's like 2 minutes of like, how was your weekend before that? But it really leans transactional. And what I believe that we need to do is to add in, more dedicated relational moments. And those we can do together when we're in person. That's more natural for us. But there are also really easy ways to do that when we're physically separated.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that distinction between transactional and relational. And what I often use is, the doing and the being, the yin and the yang, and totally, yeah. In our community, the Humane Marketing Circle, we really want to come as humans to the circle. So yes, there's the transactional piece, the doing piece, the marketing advice, but then it's a lot also about the being together as entrepreneurs who want to do marketing ethically. And that matters, I would say, just as much as just getting the answer to, what tool should I use for this and that, right? And you're right, we're so trained to always want to just have the quick fix, the next answer, where we didn't actually realize what we're missing is also the relationship and the belonging to something bigger, to a group even. So to have companies realize that, I think that's going to be a huge, huge change. Like to actually say we value to put time aside for having people create relationships and they have to pay people while this happens, right? That's going to be a huge shift. So I'm curious to hear from you. Yeah, if you envision the company of the future where people flourish at work, how does that look like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I agree, to the first part of your comment, like companies do need to invest in and spend time in this. I don't think that's different than it ever was. I think we always had our social hours and, our conferences, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need to be more intentional now. And I actually think that's a really good thing. And so if we look 5 years ahead, I think that the company that flourishes the most is the one that is most intentional about relationship building. Alongside the transactional stuff. It's funny, you were on vacation last week. I took my first business trip in 2 years last week. And as I was going through the business trip, I was like, it just feels different than it used to. And I started polling, folks on social media. I was like, have you traveled for business? And if so, like what's different now than it used to be? And one person came back and said, it's all about relationships now. And I've noticed that when I travel for business and connect with my colleagues personally, it makes all the transactional stuff so much easier. And so I think that, that's a key part of the business of the future. Will we be together or apart? I think that's going to vary by business. Some businesses will absolutely want to be together every day. Some will not. But I think it's super interesting, this comment on like, how relationships make the transactional stuff easier. And I do really believe that's a key part of what the future successful businesses will look like. The other thing that I think is really important is having conversations. We spoke to this earlier about how we work, just iterating on like what's working and what's not. When we went into the pandemic, we all flipped modes almost overnight. Mm-hmm. As we come out of the pandemic, I think it's going to be a longer journey to figuring out how we work together successfully, what it looks like to collaborate in this new environment. And so just creating regular space for having conversations about the how, not just the what, that will be a hallmark of a flourishing company.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. And I think you're right. It's away from business trips to conferences and all these kind of big meetings and agendas. We can do those online now, right? People are not going to travel for that anymore. Or I think also there's going to be more like outings and team things and, just like yeah, getting to know the humans behind the Zoom screen in a way, right? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Airbnb, I don't know if you caught this news because you were offline, and I hope you didn't actually, but
I
Airbnb
did actually.
announced.
That they
Yeah.
announced that people can now work from anywhere, right?
People can work from anywhere forever. And I think two things were really important in that announcement. One is they said, expect to come together once a quarter with your colleagues. They're still figuring out what that looks like, but they're acknowledging that there's this really urgent need for people to come together physically.
Yeah.
Two, and I think this relates to their business, but I think it's interesting for all of us. They said up to 3 months per year, you can work from any other country in the world. And also, that's about the relational, right? That's about, for them, immersing with their customers and understanding their lives. And so, I think that companies that are doubling down on this relational aspect will do well.
Yeah, I think they're definitely setting an example for the future of business. And I'm sure a lot of young generations will, they're like, that's exactly what we want. We want to work for a company. And I think we've proven many times over that this myth that we had before the pandemic, that people don't work the same amount or same hours just because they're at home. I mean, we've seen that is absolutely not true. So yeah, there's definitely good things that hopefully come out from this kind of weird times that we have gone through. And I'm glad for Airbnb to just kind of show the way. Yeah,
absolutely. And two things I want to kind of underline here. I believe, so one of the things that I studied is this, what makes behavior change successful. And if you think about New Year's resolutions, for instance, those are things that we always want to do, and yet how often are we actually successful? Behavior change is hard even when we want it, and we're in the midst of the biggest upheaval and change in our lifetimes, really. But one of the things that makes change successful is the shock of being in sort of this transition state and being in this space where everything is kind of thrown up into the air. If you think in your own life, when did the biggest change happen? It wouldn't be surprising if it was around, a move from one place to another, or a life change, having kids, getting married, graduating from college. All of these like big moments are when we make the biggest change. Right. And so right now as a society, we're in one of those big moments collectively. And so we have this real opportunity to create change right now. And I think it's sort of important for all of us to recognize that and to take advantage of it. Because I think we could slip back into the way things used to be, but I don't think many of us want to. And so it's an opportunity we have in this moment of ambiguity, is that we're all more malleable than we ever will be, either before or after.
And it somehow requires also some work on ourselves. We can't just say, oh, the company, and blame it all on the company. Because I feel like even for ourselves, well, we need to, show some flexibility, more flexibility. Maybe we need to even be okay with a pay cut. Things that we value now more because of the transformation we have gone through, they don't always come with more money. So this idea of, do I really want this promotion? Is that my next step? Or maybe do I value things differently? So I think it requires also some self-reflection and maybe changing some priorities in our own life as well.
Oh, I 1,000% agree. And actually, if the first thing that folks need to contemplate is how do they add in more of the relational interactions, the second thing I'm advocating for is consider what agency you have and use that agency. And I think this is true startup or big company, but I think it's really easy to get into the situation where you think, this is the way the world is, or this is the way things are. But absolutely, we have the chance, no matter where we sit, to kind of recognize the amount of change that we can create and to grasp that and to do something about it. And absolutely, flexibility is one of the sort of the biggest things that comes up over and over again as a desire for my clients. But what does that look like? What does it mean? What do you really want by flexibility? And often it boils down to things that are not financially related, right? It's like, I want to be able to show up for my kids' soccer games like I have been able to. I want to be able to be here when my child is sick. Things like that, I think, are much more intrinsically motivated than extrinsic. And that's part of the conversation I think we can have together is like, what do we need to be able to work healthily and well together?
Yeah, and it really is such an opportunity to have this time of change, to sit down and have this reflection, right? Because before we were just in our trans mode and just, work and sleep and work again. Now we actually have the time to think, well, what do I want out of my time here on this earth?
Yeah. I like to say that I think every person probably over the age of 2 in the world has had some sort of epiphany over the past 2 years, right? They've had this chance to reflect on what they really want. And it's helpful to remember that we're all in that space together right now. And so when better in our lives to talk about change and what we really want out of how we work together than.
Yeah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I'm so delighted that we are living in this time of change. Like, I couldn't be happier that we are, on earth right now to live through this change. And obviously I hope we'll see the other end of the change, but I'm just so grateful also for people like you who help companies pivot through this. So I'd be delighted if you shared where people can find out more about you and how you work with companies, but also smaller startups, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share that one thought before I do. You mentioned this, that we're all in this state of change and exciting, and also it'll eventually settle down. And I just want to acknowledge that change is very uncomfortable for us,
right,
whether or not we want it. And so just recognizing that it is a period of great excitement and possibility, and also it's deeply unsettling. So if it feels unsettling, that's part of the human condition. Yes, I work with companies. I have a company called Now, and it is all about helping people to flourish at work. And I work with everyone from startups to huge corporations on this. And we provide programs and also bespoke support for those companies. I can be found on all the social channels, well, except for Facebook. I don't Facebook right now, but active on LinkedIn and Instagram. And I will share a link for an article that I've written that really it's about how people can flourish as they start a new job during a pandemic, but actually it applies to anyone, and it has some really practical tips for how to increase, especially that relational aspect that we talked about.
Oh, great. I'll put that in the show notes for sure.
Great. Thank you. And then also, and I'll share a link to this, but just an offer. I would be very happy to chat one-on-one with folks who are recognizing they want to do something to change their company's focus on flourishing. And so I'll share a link to that too. Don't hesitate to reach out. Just my gift to your listeners. How can we together identify a few steps that you can make to create practical change?
Wonderful. Amazing offer. Thank you so much, Amy. You know that I always have one last question, and that is, what are you grateful for today or this week, this month?
Yeah, so much actually. One, I've been sick recently. I had long COVID, and I'm feeling better. And so I think any time you go through a health incident like that, it's just a reminder of how important health is. And I'm just such a believer in sort of the connection of mind and body and the health that, the importance of health and everything that we do. So I'm grateful for that.
Glad you're feeling better.
Thank you. But I also just want to say I'm so grateful for the community that I have. And I think that is what keeps me flourishing. I'm grateful for the other entrepreneurs like yourself who I'm lucky enough to be friends with, who are are honest and vulnerable with me about what their challenges are, and likewise I can be with them. We all need these safe spaces to be able to kind of grapple with what's easy and hard about growing a business. And so I'm so grateful for my dear friends who share their journeys with me.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's so important to have that community of close friends or other entrepreneurs who, like you say, show up real, like where you feel like, oh, this is real. I can tell the difference.
Yes. Yes. None of it's easy. So it's so great to have that support.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest on the Humane Marketing Podcast, Amy. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for inviting me in. And I'm such a fan of your work as well, Sarah. So thank you for including me in your journey.
Thank you. Thanks so much for watching and being part of a generation of marketers who cares for yourself, for your clients, and for the planet. We really are change makers before we are marketers. So go ahead, be the change you want to see in the world. And I hope to see you again next week. Take care.